take all appropriate measures, including legislative, administrative, social, and educational measures, and it continues. Now, I think that maybe this wording or the wordings of this convention could be revisited if possible, because when you say take all appropriate measures, the convention doesn't describe or define appropriate measures, and that may be why some governments will implement some very drastic and controversial strategies to fight drugs. Maybe if this kind of convention, the wordings in this convention were revisited, we could have a broader base for governments to avoid using those kind of strategies these presentations have tried to draw our attention to. Thank you.
Michelle, thanks very much. I don't know if you would like to, there were sort of two main points. Shall I leave it to you to decide who responds to them? The second one is really yours, I think. Yeah.
So, what I've done here, there's a section in here where I pull apart every clause in that. That's from the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That's Article 33. And what I do in this book here is to take all those clauses and try and pull them apart. And it's all open to debate because, like I said, this is a conversation starter. And I've taken a very broad reading of it. Some people might try and go more literal, but I've gone more kind of dynamic interpretation on it. I will say one thing about legislative, administrative, social, and educational measures. Look what's missing, right? It says including, so it's not exhaustive. But what's de-emphasized? Military and criminal. They're not in there. Nobody said launch a war on drugs in this thing. Nobody said send the cops out after the kids. The thing about, I'll leave Rick maybe to the death penalty, although it's connected. The thing about helping the students, you know, the evidence suggests that expulsion's a really bad idea. That's the first way to go. And what drives young people to use drugs? I mean, don't put your hands up, but just there's loads of people in this room who've used them. Just what drove you to do it? It's probably fun, boredom for the vast majority of people. The vast majority of young people who start will stop eventually. What sometimes you might call regression to the mean. People just transition out of it. The people who become problematic users, there's other stuff going on in their lives, but the serious majority of people aren't. And the problem is we've designed a system where we treat everybody as if they're problematic. And that disallows us to target people because we've taken a blunt criminal law focus that drives people away from ever wanting to put up their hand, like I just mentioned.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I mean, I would come back to the drug conventions as well. I mean, I put up that part from the preamble, the opening lines of the preamble to the 1961 Drug Convention, talking about, you know, being concerned with the health and welfare of mankind. It's the first line in the convention. And I think you could argue a very good case that, and actually when you read the history of the drafting of drug treaties, even going back to the League of Nations treaties, drug control is very often typically described in humanitarian terms. So there is this kind of ethos going back, and it's reflected in that, a bit of that preamble, that the reason we control drugs is because we want to help people and make people better. But as Damon says, I think what's happened is whatever instinct there might have been around that kind of humanitarian ethos and that, you know, health promoting, right to health kind of ethos that we see reflected in that language gets significantly undermined when, as I said in the second part of that preamble, when we start to talk about drug addiction as something that's evil, or we start to talk about drugs as threats to democracy, security of the state, and this kind of language is very, you know, sort of over-the-top kind of language that almost justifies almost any kind of extreme response, and also, I would think, makes it almost imperative upon states that if you're not taking this kind of extreme response, then somehow, as you said, you're being lax in your response. And I think we see that in the work of the International Narcotics Control Board. You know, if Colombia is not spraying poisons out of the back of planes over coca fields and everything else it drifts over, then you're not actually, you know, sort of fighting the war on drugs. And this is where it becomes problematic, because on the ground, and Damon's pictures I think showed this much better than mine, what you're talking about around drug use is individual behaviors and individual people from a variety of circumstances with a variety of vulnerabilities who engage in that behavior. And some people get into problems with that, health problems, social problems, economic problems, criminal justice problems. The vast majority don't. So I think Damon put it very nicely, is what we have is a system that's designed for one particular kind of extreme, which gets exacerbated over everything. And unfortunately, sort of the human rights elements of that get overwhelmed by this sort of fear. And that's why I sort of mentioned, I showed that quote from the '88 political declaration on drugs, because I think that language is so similar to some of the declarations or the rhetoric we see around the war on terror. And interestingly, when the war on terror was declared in 2001, immediately we saw the human rights community, we saw the European Union, we saw other the UN agencies immediately recognizing the risk to human rights coming from this language and talking about human rights constraints within fighting the war on terror. And we have declarations on human rights in combating terrorism. We don't have that in the context of fighting the war on drugs, which so many countries see themselves as fighting, even though in many ways the conception of what's at risk from that sort of rhetorical structure is the same. And that's where I think we sort of get these very egregious kinds of criminal justice responses or policy responses that make people more vulnerable.
Thank you both. Other hands, please stand.
Thank you. My name is Diana, PhD student, and probably this question is for you. From the point of view of a producer country like Colombia, for example, many people in the civil society have said that the only way to stop the very bad results of the traffic of drugs, like, in terms of violence, militarization, aerial sprays, funding of illegal groups in the armed conflict, is actually by legalizing the consumption and the production of drugs. What I think is more interesting is during the last government of the President Santos, he was very open to these kind of proposals, and he actually said that he will be able to consider these kind of ideas if the international community will support him. So my question is, do you think that it would be possible that once the international community would really take seriously these kind of ideas?
Well, I know Damon will have a lot to say on this too. I think what's actually interesting in terms of international relations at the moment is you're actually starting to see that debate open up, and it's being very much driven by Latin American countries, presidents, and just we've had a couple of meetings just recently, Cartagena and some other things, where we've had presidents of Central American and South American countries, primarily for security reasons, coming out and sort of saying that this sort of very militarized approach to the war on drugs is actually, not doing the things that '88 political declaration says about, securing the viability of the state and ensuring democracy, but in fact it's undermining those things by militarizing the situation and in many cases empowering, the sort of criminal cartels. So I think what's interesting at the moment is we're sort of having this debate opened up at a very high level in a number of countries, presidents of countries sort of coming out and talking about these things. So in terms of debates and discussions around alternative sort of rubrics to how to deal with drugs away from strict prohibition, and whether that's sort of legalization or regulation or control or decriminalization, which we have of use, and which is another debate. In Portugal we have forms of decriminalization, some other countries. It's actually an interesting time because we do see a debate opening up sort of beyond the kind of NGO level and actually moving up more into people with political power. Of course, there's very strong reactions against that from states that have a very strong entrenched interest in maintaining the war on drugs.
Yeah, with Colombia, I've heard that before, that we want to see something change, but we're not going to do it unless it's all of the governments of the world coming together. It's never going to happen. You're never going to get all of the governments eventually deciding to change this, because the Russians aren't going to move, the Chinese aren't going to move, and the Iranians aren't going to move, and so on. And if you're looking for consensus on it, it's not going to happen. In fact, it seems to me that one of the problems has been that somehow you need consensus, as if this is a global singular problem and not a whole selection of cultural and regional and security and human rights problems that are trying to be pulled under one rather restrictive umbrella. If regional bodies like OAS or any other regional entities want to move, I think they're going to have to do it on their own and basically develop the international argument. The problem is that what goes on behind the scenes is just before the Cartagena summit, the people pushing for that was Guatemala. And just before it, of course, you had the vice president and other senior US officials flying down there and saying, this isn't going to work. So, I mean, the other question that comes up is about the drug conventions. It's the connected thing. In order to actually do that, you have to undo the 3 conventions that Rick talked about. And one of the issues that comes up is what do you replace them with from an international legal perspective. Now, if you take, and I agree broadly that you should, if you take the drug trade out of the hands of criminal gangsters, it's inevitably going to gravitate towards business. So then any business and human rights people should start looking into this. Now, it's going to happen eventually, I think, but it's going to be a long way off. It'd be good to see the research being done now on the risks of corporations getting their hands on some of the commodities that criminals currently have. But as for the other thing that a diplomat told me recently was, I don't want to get into a treaty negotiation with some countries these days. It's not 1952, it's not 1960s. I don't want to be renegotiating this with them now. I'd rather try and work within the current international legal framework because it could get worse. You know?
Thank you. I think, did you have your hand up?
It was basically a similar question to the legalization thing. Is there any indication whether it's viable? Because I thought of the same topic because in some countries they've made this move with prostitution, where they've legalized prostitution to the extent so that the state can actually fulfill its human rights obligations by controlling. But is it actually, are there any indications that it's viable, that there could be state control or state regulation?
Right. Well, I mean, no one's tried it for a long time. Bear in mind that the current system we have has been a developing international experiment over the last 100 years. It's not exactly something that historically existed. In that time, it seems that things have gotten worse. But there's very few examples that people can go on. One of them is Portugal, where across the board drugs are decriminalized. It doesn't mean it's legal, but it's criminal sanctions aren't applied. And the best you can say from that, it's ups and downs, like all policy, right? It's not broad, it's not entirely successful or unsuccessful. What you can see is that the sky didn't fall in. And you do see rates among some demographics going up a little bit, usually older people. Related to my topic, rates of drug use among the 15 to 19-year-old age group, which is the one you might want to be most concerned about, came down. HIV rates came down, prison rates came down, and so on. But it did connect at the time with a lot more spending on social and health issues. And this is one of the issues that, again, it comes back to about actually sex work too. So you have somewhere like New Zealand where you can put in a regulated model quite well because of the infrastructure. It actually connects to the issue I talked about with the children in Odessa too, versus say someone doing the same thing in the UK. How do you take the same market, even in sex work, and regulate that in sub-Saharan Africa in a mining town with nothing connected to it? You know what I mean? There's a real issue of infrastructure there, and the same goes for drugs. One of the arguments against legalization that comes out, although I think it's false, is you're expecting development countries to put in health safety nets for the aftermath. The flip side, of course, is, well, we're already expecting them to put in criminal justice instruments for what's going on now. It's all going to cost money. It all depends on how you're going to spend it. But and either way, people should be putting in health systems right now. I'm sure Professor Hunt would agree. Is it viable? I mean, at the point is at the moment that the debate's opening up about whether it should be. What's good from a human rights perspective is to come at it from outside of the drug policy sphere, where that's often a loggerheads argument, and just to look at it less, or not dispassionately, because it's hard to do that, but look at it with less of a less prejudice as to where you come from. Just look at it from a human rights perspective and see what you come up with.
I think a lot of these questions within the context of the Human Rights Center at Essex, and one of the reasons I think we're quite excited to be associated with the Human Rights Center here, is these kind of questions point up the ways in which a lot of these human rights and drugs issues can be dealt with in a manner that's interdisciplinary. I mean, we've obviously talked a lot about international law and international legal instruments, but even the questions in the discussion, we're getting into issues of health policy, we're getting into issues of development, we're getting into issues of, other areas of criminal justice or gender equality issues or children's rights issues. So, I mean, when we get into issues of drug policy and human rights, there's lots of different approaches you can bring into it, and you should bring into it to actually come up with policies and solutions that are going to be effective, because there are ways, as you said, you can measure in a lot of ways. If you're looking at a health policy related to drugs, in a lot of cases, you can measure the health impacts of a particular criminal justice approach and bring that into good policy making or good lawmaking. So I think in terms of our interest, the interdisciplinary nature of the Human Rights Center here lends itself very well to sort of discussing these issues in the round and looking at human rights from a variety of different perspectives.
Thanks, Rick. Any final questions? We've been... Jo Young, please.
Hello, I'm Ji Young. Thank you very much, both of you, for good presentations. And my question is, maybe it can be a bit broad, but my question is, can you tell us some good state practice which can be considered to be close to human rights-based approach to drug policy and law? It's very broad, so maybe you can give us some examples, maybe focusing only on children, drug policies, and human rights, for instance. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I mean, in terms of the issues of, what our other job is working on issues related primarily to health issues for people who use drugs. And there's lots of good examples internationally of health policy frameworks or legal frameworks that are more health promoting for people who actually use drugs, particularly people who inject drugs. Because one of the things we find in terms of increasing the risk for people of contracting HIV or hepatitis C, risks of overdose, risks of incarceration, which therefore increase other kinds of health risk. We can see very clearly where punitive approaches, mandatory sentencing, we see that in the United States quite a lot, or legal frameworks that actually legally prohibit scientifically proven medical interventions. And so in our sector, we talk a lot about Russia and the fact that Russia criminalizes methadone, which is a medicine that you can take as a substitution to heroin. So you don't actually have to inject heroin. You can get your methadone prescription from your doctor. Very many countries of the world have in place public health policies that would provide essential medical services and HIV prevention services and overdose prevention services to people who use drugs to decrease their vulnerability and actually recognize their right to the highest attainable standard of health, recognizing that a person who uses drugs or a person who injects drugs, they live their life in a specific context, they have specific health vulnerabilities because of that behavior. And rather than just criminalize them, we're going to actually engage them as recipients of health services and put in place sort of non-judgmental services that meet their needs as drug users. And lots of good examples like that around the world, in whether or not Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Asia, Australia, certain parts of North America, where there's large issues around injecting drug use and HIV. On the flip side of that, we can see the bad examples that happen when you criminalize those populations very harshly, because what happens is you essentially deny them access to those medical services on the one hand, which means that rates of overdose or HIV will go up. You also drive them away from medical services. So people go underground. You have the sort of situations where Damon was showing you of homelessness, of marginalization, of going in and out of prison, which has all the other kinds of vulnerabilities, both short-term and long-term. So when we come to health policies, and I said Professor Hunt did work on this when he was Special Rapporteur, there are very good examples of national or even local legislative and policy frameworks that would promote the right to health of people who use drugs.
Yeah, I mean, the list of good and bad examples, I think, is fairly long. I mean, when it comes to children and young people, the first thing to do, it seems, is to at least allow yourself the possibility that a lot of the drug use happening is non-problematic, and that it's a phase of development and it's a phase of adolescence, and for the vast majority, it's going to be a transitional thing, and that seems to be the case. But there are, particularly young children, if they're using drugs, you know you're already in a spot of bother, so you've got to intervene in some manner. Older adolescents, you need to look for patterns of vulnerability, things that are adding to that. One of the things that you find in drug policy as you move forward is that a lot of the best things that you can do have very little to do with drug interventions at all. So everyone wants to educate kids out of starting, and people want to try and treat people who are dependent and so on, which of course we should try and do. But I'll give you a country which is an example of good and bad practice at the exact same time. It's Sweden, right? So Sweden has pretty low rates of drug use generally among children and young people. It's got pretty low rates of problematic drug use in the adult population too, generally. It's got very little to do with Sweden's drug policies. It's got more to do with Sweden's general culture of temperance over many decades. A very strong social contract, high rates of tax that people are very happy to pay, strong health systems, low income inequality, excellent schools, and so on and so on and so on. Really strong social safety nets across the board. And then you get to their drug policy, which is quite bad, because Sweden has decided that they'll have a restrictive drug policy. So what you do is you have all those social safety nets which can't catch everybody, and in denying what we all refer to as harm reduction programs, generally, there's some, but it's not scaled up enough, people fall through the gaps. In fact, one of Professor Hunt's recommendations after his mission to Sweden in 2007 was to scale these things up for HIV prevention. Because in a country like Sweden, 30% of your new HIV infections should not be through injecting drug use, and that's what it currently is. And those are the infections that happen in Sweden. Because still there's only 2 needle and syringe programs in the country. And this is where the gaps are happening, and the age restriction on that is 20, even though the age of initiation into injecting drug use in the country on average is 17. These are the gaps. So there's good and bad things you can do at the exact same time.
Let me take one final question, if there is one. We should begin to